Great. And we are live. Typically, we're just waiting a couple of minutes for everybody to join um, before we truly start. And I hope you are all excited to learn more about how to put your clinical trial results to use and build trust and also prevent consumer skepticism. All right. Well, I think we can start then. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am really excited to have you all here with us. My name is Suzanne. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citrus Labs, and I'm joined today by Cristina Poindexter, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Parable, and Heather Bustos, who is the owner and partner at Bustos Law Group. Now, in terms of content, this webinar is all about how to build trust with your clinical trial results and how to prevent consumer skepticism, all while staying compliant with FTC and FDA regulations. And as always, there will be a Q&A at the end, and please put your questions in the Q&A field in Zoom or just put them in the chat. Now, before we start, I want to take also some time for some quick introductions, and I will start with Citrus Labs. We are the fastest growing provider of clinical trials for brands. We work with a lot of brands in the health and wellness industry and cover cosmetics, supplements, superfoods, devices, and world-class brands such as Parable, as well as Hum Nutrition, Say Beauty, and also Your Super. Our clients and our mission really is to elevate brands with affordable clinical studies to then create research-backed product claims that drive business growth. Enough about us. Cristina, please tell us a little bit about Parable.
Sure thing. And thanks for having me here, Suzanne. You guys have been great partners to us, and I have lots of great things to say about Citrus itself. So my name is Cristina Poindexter. As Suzanne said, I'm the co-founder, co-CEO of Parable. Parable is a company setting out to demystify brain health for the midlife adult consumer. We build science-based, efficacious products for long-term brain health. So the first product that we've released was formulated by neuroscientists and tested by Citrus Labs that supports long-term brain health across cognitive health, mental health, and neural health. That's a bit about us.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And we'll obviously talk a little bit more about Parable and also your study later. Now, next up is Heather.
Hi, thank you so much, Suzanne, for having me. Cristina, I'm so excited to jump into this chat with you. A little bit about Bustos Law Group. So I'm the managing partner, and we are compliance counsel for brands on a mission. So essentially, we help brands regulated by the FDA, FTC to support their driving mission. We service food, supplement, cosmetic, medical devices. We do a little bit of OTC as well. And we help companies from manufacturers and distributors to importers and just straight brand owners. So kind of all across the supply chain. Some of the services we provide are things like label, marketing reviews. We do GMP audits. So if you're a manufacturer, distributor, we can help with auditing and to make sure you have no gaps. We also do registrations. And if there's ever a situation where you get into trouble, we can also help on that end with recalls or warning letters. Basically, we've been doing this. I've been doing this in my firm for about 6 years, but we have a team of consultants and attorneys who specialize in each of these areas who are either former FDA or have been in the industry 10 years or more. So we have a great team on board, and that's a little bit about Bustos Law Group.
Awesome, thank you. And Bustos has been a great partner also to the brands we've been working with. And super amazing to have you here as always, Heather. Now, let's start with getting a little bit into detail why we are all here, building trust. Cristina, Parable is a really science-forward brand that uses an evidence-based approach. And why did you actually decide to conduct your own clinical study even before you launched Parable versus relying on ingredient research?
Yeah. So I'll start by giving a bit of context just about what is Parable Daily. So Daily is the name of our product. Daily is a supplement for long-term brain health. It's composed of 8 different brain active ingredients, 5 of which are branded ingredients. And it's couched in essentially an oat base, so it's just oats. And that allows it to mix in really well with a coffee, a tea, a smoothie, a protein shake, things of that kind. And the reason I mentioned some of those the ingredients, the 5 branded ingredients and the others, is that as a company, as a brand, we actually did not have to do a clinical study in order to release the product to market. We had multiple nutritional neuroscientists formulate the product together with some food scientists, some procurement, supply chain specialists, and a few others as well. So the product as a whole was already solid, and it already essentially came because of our individual ingredients with enough evidence in human clinical populations for long-term brain health. Now, the reason that we chose to invest in a single group study with Citrus Labs was for really 2 main reasons. One, candidly, was ethical. We are working in the brain supplement space. If there is any industry that people think is snake oil, it is this one, right? And for myself and my co-founder, we're both multiple time entrepreneurs. We've got all sorts of ideas of, what we could build to help people. And we had a very candid conversation, which was like, look, if we can't prove out and we don't know with certainty that this actually works and does what we say it does, like, what are we doing, right? Like there's a level of ultimate just craving of data in order to have that ethical moral foundation, especially given we're selling a supplement that is affecting people's brains. The second point of what we really wanted to accomplish was because, again, we are approaching this product space as holistic brain nutrition, where holistic really means it is supporting not just your cognitive health, not just your mental health, and not just your neural health. It's helping across the board. And as you might imagine, there are a number of claim sets that are nested even underneath each of those. So essentially the world of what this thing does and the world of things to say about what it does is very wide. And from a consumer experience standpoint, what we wanted to ultimately understand was, what do people actually feel the most? We know it's actually what it's doing in the brain. What do people actually feel the most, and when do they start to feel it? So the other piece here that separates Daily as a brain supplement from others on the market is that we designed it for the long term. We didn't design it for the short term, and we didn't design it to immediately give you acute benefits in the realm of focus or calm or energy or any of those things. The funny trick in here, though, is like, over the course of a month, we know that this product actually measurably shifts those, and the study actually proved that out. So that's a long-winded way of saying the second goal for us in pursuing the study was to understand at which point along that 31-day journey did people start to feel things, and what did they feel the most? And a single group study allowed us to essentially do 3 different camps of measures and get a very wide breadth of data so that we understood where there was the most heat, so that in the future, to do another clinical trial that maybe goes more in depth on a certain, population set or disease state or anything of that kind, we know where we want to focus more. So that whole spread was around a digital cognitive battery test. It was visual analog scales to measure mental well-being, and it was also some actual biomarkers of inflammation. So across that full spectrum, we now understand where the product actually does show the most substantial clinical efficacy, and where it doesn't show as much on the 31-day scale. So I'll stop there because I can tell I'm getting in the weeds.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think, from what I've been seeing, also, with other clients, is that your study, Cristina, was really sophisticated. You mentioned visual analog scales, battery testing, inflammatory markers. This is something like this depth is something that we typically don't see a lot. And obviously, you came to us already with a study design in mind. And what helped you to actually prepare to have this much clarity on which type of study you want to run, which markers you want to include, and also which type of test you want to include?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I am the business person in the room, right? The one of the benefits of working with nutritional neuroscientists is they are neuroscientists, right? So we folks on our advisory board, and certainly have worked incredibly closely with them in the course of building Parable. So a lot of those recommendations, suggestions, curiosities came from those folks themselves. I'll mention one, Dr. Con Stow has been a central figure for us, and certainly lent a lot of his knowledge to how we would go about learning. And his, academic background is in the cognitive sciences, and he himself has run clinicals for multiple decades in his career, both as an academic, a professor, a clinical researcher, and all of that, right? But the benefit I'll say here of us, working with Citrus, you guys, Suzanne, is we could actually execute the study in a fairly budget conscious way for a pre-seed stage startup. And candidly, like quite quickly, right? I think from end to end, it was 3 months in order to execute the entire study. And that included a 31-day study itself, right? So that's not something we could necessarily do if we partnered with an academic institution that runs a bit slower. And so that's something that I want to give Citrus a shout out for, of just their professionalism of pushing it through on a really tight time frame.
Yeah, that's what we do.
Yes.
Tight time frames. That's our thing, always. And before you actually started your study with us, did you do some preliminary in-house research?
Yeah. So this is where I have my own background. I kind of bring a lot of both kind of the culture and the experience of running a lot of consumer studies. I won't go into my whole path, but I started my career at Google and worked in product marketing for a long time. And so I'm staying close to the consumer and really understanding from the ground up what is the need in the market is ultimately how I go about building innovations and building new products, and understanding that there's a there, as they say. And so we actually came into the clinical, we had already done 5 consumer studies, so studied over 1,000 folks on everything from, their ultimate need, how they describe what they're actually looking for in the brain health space. We did a study actually on probiotics as sort of a parallel example of a wellness product that doesn't give you an acute benefit, to try to understand some of the behavioral effects of that and how to message around those. We studied price, we studied all sorts of things, but the ultimate goal for us was to study the actual product in a what is the word, disintermediated way of, like, I never interacted with any of the participants, right? Like all of it was done through Citrus Labs as a third party to really reduce bias and make sure that we were being, sound about the data.
Awesome. So, before the actual study, you did a lot of market research, which is great, because this is why you had so much anecdotal data then that these learnings put into your actual study. And this is also what we typically recommend new brands are doing. Now, moving over to Heather. Heather, you are working with a lot of brands, and I already mentioned, I would assume that you also see that not a lot of brands bring this amount of sophistication to their studies, like Cristina and Parable. And what would you advise a brand that wants to make claims, go for the clinical study right from the start, or rely on ingredient research?
So, and I do think what Cristina said is true in the case of their specific product. I think that was a great play to start off with, doing the consumer studies. Absolutely. When it comes to, I think generally, like I have a rule across the board, is what you want to do first. And I'm coming from the FDA compliance side, right? So not as much on the study side, although I do have some FTC carryover in what I do as well. But generally, you want to look at what kind of claims you want to make about the product, and are those going to fit within the category So for example, in the case of Parable, they're a dietary supplement. So there's certain rules about the types of claims that they can make. You have to be cautious not to make disease claims. You can make what are called structure function claims, whereas there may be other areas, let's say medical devices, where you can't make the same types of claims. So you want to first categorize. That's really the most important part, is making sure you're categorizing your product. Then you can determine the types of claims. In the supplement space specifically, one of the biggest trouble areas is people making disease claims. So you want to definitely make sure, and it's not just the claim itself, right? It can be from the pictures, it can be in the name of the product. There's many ways that you can make claims. Labeling is not just the actual package. There's extension of that into your websites, into your social media even. So I don't think it's a good idea to do clinical study right from the start. I think it's important to figure out where your product fits. Sometimes that's really easy to determine. Sometimes that's a little more difficult. And you're seeing that now, where there's products that kind of have carryover between multiple. And I do have products sometimes that are flexible, where they could be considered, let's say, a conventional beverage, but also a liquid supplement. And that's an analysis that needs to be done before you even start determining what kind of claims. And then once you determine the claims, the next step is, how do we substantiate the claims we're going to make? And that's where the clinical study part would come in.
Because you mentioned, liquid supplements, are you referring to these drinks, these probiotic apple cider vinegar drinks that we see
It
popping
could
up?
be. There's a lot, and it's becoming more. Yeah, it's becoming more common, where you see these. They call it functional food and beverages, where it's not just a typical beverage. It's providing more benefits. And there are times where, like I said, it can be flexible. It can kind of move between either space. FDA even has a specific guidance. I want to say that's the actual name of the guidance, is distinguishing between liquid supplements. It's the exact terminology. So I think, that is one of those things that we're seeing more and more. And so it's even more important that you have that discussion, with your team as to what category you're going to fall into. That's step 0, in my opinion, then claims, and then clinical study, if we're trying to make it really, easy to digest into those steps.
Okay, so it sounds super easy. It's 3 steps. First, what is my category as a product, right? Then second, what kind of claims do I want to make? And then third, how can I substantiate these claims then with a clinical study?
Right. And there's different ways to substantiate. There's different levels. So that's also another analysis. So I think those are, like I said, we're trying to make it easily digestible. Those are the 3 steps. But within those steps, there's a lot of analysis that goes into that, and time and energy to making sure that you're doing things the right way.
Absolutely, yeah. And now, moving over to, kind of this, reducing skepticism, and, building trust. Cristina, you have a dedicated science subpage on your website in which you explain more about how your product works and the ingredients. You also present the clinical trial results, and the way in which you present your study is very easily digestible for consumers. And what I'm seeing a lot is many brands are keeping their studies behind closed doors and just making a couple of claims based on their results. And why did you decide to publish more details about your study and, to be more transparent around the whole, science space as well?
Yeah. So it goes to 2 things. One, it comes from, again, kind of that ethical, moral stance that both my co-founder and I have. That's really important for us to actually walk the talk and share what we learned, right? Like, here's the actual results. This is what we know, right? The second is specifically with the topic area that we work within, which is brain health. One thing that we've known from some of our early consumer studies is there's really 2 problems that as a business we need to solve. The first one is if I go to any of you listening here and I ask you, is your brain important to your health, right? You're probably going to say yes, right? 9 out of 10 people will say yes. If I then ask you, okay, so what are you doing to care for your brain? right? It's kind of like, oh God, crickets, I don't know, like, ooh, don't get me wrong, you know, it's kind of this anxiety moment of, well, there's this known gap between something that we value and the knowledge of how to actually care for it and the behavior of actually caring for it, right? There's a gap. And that gap is why we actually founded Parable. But what it also lends itself to is we know that for us, when we create solutions, solutions need to span everything from the education of helping you as a consumer bridge that gap of going from, I care about my brain, I have no idea what to do about it, to I care about my brain, I know what I could be doing about it, to I care about my brain and now I'm doing something about it, right? And so in that journey, right, of education and empowerment, science is needed, right? I think there's certain brands that, and even for us, it's important to be in the world of consumer and even, you know, work in the Instagram influencers of the world to get the word out and, you know, lend their own version of legitimacy and trust, but not at the expense of the science and not at the expense of the facts. So the reason that we actually built out the page is that we know that we're up against kind of a harder sell, candidly, of there's a lot of products out there that are nootropics that will immediately give you this sense of focus or will immediately calm you down. And that's actually not solving the root problem, which is your ultimate health, the ultimate health of your brain. And so to make that larger solve, it's kind of a harder sales pitch, candidly, and it requires this consideration process and a lot of kind of knowledge and engagement and fact. And bringing the science into that is something that we've been bullish on and that we believe people actually want and are ready for, especially if they're going to make kind of this long-term investment in their brain health, right? We feel is like something that we owe to people.
So it's all about, you know, positioning your brand. I really like that. Yeah. Do you still run into skeptics besides, you know, the science subpage?
All the time. Yeah. It's, you know, what we've learned is it's not enough to have the influencers. It's not enough to do the science. Like the ultimate way to get people over the hump is to get them to actually try the product for long enough to actually believe, right? And actually start feeling the benefits. And so we know that we're making a big ask of people. And ultimately, like that is, you know, I think one of the interesting parts of working in the brain health space, and also one of the challenges, candidly.
I like that. Yeah. So, you know, people really have to try the product. Obviously, there's the science, there's everything, you have everything. But then, you know, oh, does it really work? I don't know. Yeah. Let them try the product and then they can actually feel the benefits. I love it. And Heather, do you think it is beneficial for brands to reveal, you know, these kind of details about their studies on their website, like Parable did? Or do you think, you know, these simple claims that we often see, like 75% felt more energetic, you know, are these enough?
I think that having it on your website, even though it's not required, like the market is asking for it. Like ultimately, the conversations I'm having now with clients is so different from what I was having when I first started my firm, where a lot of, you know, brands were more focused on, you know, what they could do, the claims. They weren't worried about substantiation. Like that was an afterthought. And now the types of products that are going on the market and the way, you know, the way that just the market is going is science is coming first. Like I'm getting those questions up front, whereas before it was kind of that afterthought, like, do we really need to? And you're seeing this movement as well with the FTC, right? The FTC just came out with a guidance where they're now requiring a higher level of substantiation for supplements, for OTCs, or rather for medical devices, for all of these different products where it was a much lower bar to substantiate. So I think it's a good idea to, at a very minimum, include some information about the studies, because ultimately, like I said, even though it's not a requirement to include that, it's just going to help your brand to grow. And it's going to help set you apart from, as Cristina was talking about, those people that are just focused on the influencers and they don't really care how the product really works and they don't really care about the substantiation part.
Yeah. once I think a lot of brands, they really, throw a lot at marketing and really forget about substantiation. And speaking about substantiation, Christina, your study also included biomarkers, like blood tests. We talked already about inflammatory markers. And a study involving markers is typically more expensive than one that is purely based on participant-reported outcomes. And why did you decide to then also invest in blood tests?
Yeah. So this goes back to one of the goals of the study really was to understand, basically get data across a very wide array of markers. And for the brain specifically, there's so many different ways to measure what's going on in the brain. And it's not just the brain, it's also your body and systemically what's going on. And so again, that's why we chose to do a mix of digital cognitive battery tests, visual analog scales, which is a fancy way of saying a kind of a sophisticated questionnaire around mental well-being scores. And then we did biomarkers, measures of inflammation, things like homocysteine and the like. And for the biomarkers themselves, this actually goes back to product strategy for the business and acknowledging the space that we're in, which is there are a lot of at-home tests these days to kind of self-diagnose or to help yourself measure improvements in various things. And candidly, we're in a really tricky area with essentially brain inflammation, in the sense that brain inflammation is a medical claim that we do not claim. I'll leave it at that. But the reasons we wanted to measure some of those biomarkers is because we wanted to have the data on what we know our product to actually do as it pertains those inflammatory markers, so that we can make decisions down the line as it pertains product strategy of whether we wanted to go more into a diagnostics realm, or if we wanted to pair the product with surveys or some wearable, right? And that allowed us to get a real sense of, well, candidly, how fast can these biomarkers change, right? And candidly, like biomarkers take quite a while to change. And so it's not a direction that we decided to go in. But having that data actually allows us to make a more strategic decision from kind of a product roadmap standpoint, because we have the data, before deciding what to do about it, right? So it is really important for us, though. The main goal was to really start with this wide array of markers, and then with subsequent clinicals, like choose which area we wanted to study in more depth against a placebo. And it is, I'll say, it's something that, as we're a venture capital backed business, as we've gone out and spoken to investors, some investors are very sophisticated, especially if they're in the healthcare space or the health tech space, in terms of knowing about regulation, knowing about clinical trials, knowing what questions to ask. But candidly, others really aren't, right? And like the one question that they'll ask is like, oh, was it against a placebo? And ours wasn't, right? And it was something that we had to explain of like, why isn't it against a placebo? And so I would advise anyone here on the call to really, really think through that, because I still think it was valid for us to do the much wider study where we were able to do this whole range of measures. But what we gave up in that was not doing a double-blind placebo study on, one or two different measures, right? With it, our goal was always like, we'll get there, but if you're going out, for example, and raising venture capital, like based off of a clinical trial, candidly, my advice would be like, do it against a placebo, right? Because you're going to get those questions. And it's something that Suzanne, as we're here speaking, like, I think what Citrus Labs is doing in order to bring more clinicals into candidly business and into industry is really important, because there's not as much knowledge as I think is necessary around how do you actually measure wellness products or beauty products or anything that's in kind of that wellness non-medical space in ways that are actually legitimate, right? And non-clinical. Like it's kind of, you're in the middle of two lanes. And as you go, speak to investors, there's still not a ton of knowledge around how testing actually works. And so there is still skepticism. So the more all of us can do in terms of doing these studies, talking about these studies, bringing them to the investment community, I think it'll help kind of all of us across the board, and ultimately help the products that are efficacious win, right? And that's what we want to do as wellness entrepreneurs and the people who actually believe in these products and the goodness of them.
Yeah, I agree. The good thing, though, was that even though it wasn't tested against a placebo, it wasn't a double-blind randomized control study, you still involved like a lot of objective markers. And when you think about study design, it kind of is okay, you are pre-seed, I think you were when you started the study with us. Not a lot of funding, right? Not like the big budgets that the big guys have. So what do? Do you run an RCT, a randomized control study, that is mostly participant reported outcome, or do you run a more sophisticated single group study where you actually test also biomarkers and include objective data measurement? So this is kind of also the thinking behind it. And I'm a fan also of biomarkers, and I think studies that involve markers are generally a little bit more sophisticated, even though they might not be test against the placebo. But talking about study design, why don't we ask the expert Heather? Do you think that study design matters? From a legal perspective, are studies with biomarkers seen as better versus questionnaire-based studies?
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely think it's important to carefully plan out. That's crucial. Making sure that you're controlling bias, minimizing variation. So design is important. There is like a level that FTC requires, and then you can always go above that. And like I said, we're trending in that direction where people are starting to meet or exceed FTC requirements just because of the nature of the market and the way that it's trending. When it comes to studies with biomarkers versus questionnaire based, I do think the studies with biomarkers are better. One is like giving you data, the other is asking people about the effects. I want to ask you, Suzanne, do you think that it's best if you combine the two? Is that something that people ask you to do?
Yeah.
And does that give you even better view?
Yeah, exactly. Because they are things, for example, with Cristina study, cognitive battery testing is questionnaire based, right? But it is also objective data measurement because it's a set of tests that nobody can learn, and then we can measure executive functioning in the brain. This is obviously questionnaire based. This is also tied to how are you feeling, what are actually the effects, and then kind of including what is happening in the body with blood markers, I think is really best practice.
Yeah, and it'll support what comes out in the questionnaires.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
So from a legal perspective, you think it's important considering different study designs? And is there, from your opinion, is there a preferred study design?
I mean, I think there's different levels, and like I said, there's an FTC base level of the randomized clinical trials. But I do think it's important, like I said, from a compliance perspective, you want to meet the bare minimum. But anything over that, it's really just going to make you more authoritative, when it comes to the results that come out. So yes, it is very important. And again, just from a perspective of what's going on in the market, it's going to be beneficial to have those studies done.
And I want to switch the conversation to Cristina again with your advisory board. You already mentioned them a couple of times, and looking at this slide, you have really amazing scientific advisors. We also rarely see that in brands. And it really shows that you care deeply about research, about validation, about the efficacy of your product. And why did you actually decide to build out this scientific advisory board? And do you think that every brand in the industry should have one?
Yeah, well, again, what we're working within, which is brain health, I think requires it. And I'll share one interesting thing in having worked with the very smart people you see on the screen in black and white there, but also others that aren't, that were more kind of behind the scenes and not listed, is that one of the things that we see as innovators, entrepreneurs who are actually building products, again, outside of the clinical space, more in that wellness space, is ultimately one of the tricky things to decide is which academic discipline to pull into your company and your studies and your product innovation process as like the scientific basis, right? And the reason I mention this is, as you pair a neuroscientist with a psychiatrist, with a psychologist, with a functional medicine doctor, with an acupuncturist, with a holistic practitioner, right? All of these folks have, slightly different views on the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think traditionally in their fields, it feels a little threatening sometimes in order to actually cross outside those lines and have this conversation about like, here's what we know from our discipline and here's what we don't know from our discipline, right? And one thing that was really important for us from the start, again, is to demystify brain health as a topic, right? And because there's so many different types of figures that are working to understand the space, working to help people who are experiencing cognitive challenges or, are interested in this in some way, it was important for us to really build a diverse set of academic and clinical experience sets in the formulation room so that we had different voices in our ears from the get-go. So why was it ultimately important to build that? I mean, the most obvious answer is like, I am not a neuroscientist. Like I am not the scientist. I am the business person. But in order to build, again, an efficacious product, we wanted to build something that was better than what was on the market today. And to do that, we needed to bring together disparate voices and ultimately create this synergistic product, again, that has 8 active ingredients. Usually brain health supplements on the market have, 3 or 4 in order to just barely pass kind of their claim set. That is a little bit of a dig. I am a little biased because I am very proud of what we built. There are some good ones out there as well, but I think that can only, the real results that we got from our clinical show the genius of the folks on the screen here, right? Show the beauty that happens when you actually build together a group of people that come from the world of research, and like, this is what they do, like it's their knowledge set. One other thing I'll say is it's actually quite welcomed for some in the world of when they're medical doctors or scientists. Some absolutely do not want to work with industry as if it's going to taint them, but others are really craving a way to take their knowledge and what they've learned and actually make it actionable in people's lives, right? Con Stow is a great example of this, Dr. Con Stow. He's researched, how different nutrients affect the brain for pharmacology, for nutraceuticals, for nootropics, for decades. And a lot of his studies are out there, but he doesn't necessarily have a chance to like make the thing, right? And make sure that he's actually steering us away from some of the like functional mushrooms on the market that people make claims about for the brain, but ultimately we don't know the mechanisms by which they work and they don't have solid science, right? So that's one of the reasons to work with it, is like, if you're trying to make a product that is very high quality, bring in the experts, right?
Yeah, I love that your advisory board has so many different backgrounds, and I can only sense that sometimes it might be a little bit difficult because of very different viewpoints. But I also think that this really helps you innovate because you have so many different opinions. That's really great. Now, you have your study, you have an amazing advisory board, you have an amazing product, and Parable really is set up for success. So what's next for you, Cristina?
Yeah, well, we're at the phase where we started Parable in spring of 2021. It's the spring of 2023. We launched daily the holistic brain nutrition product online in late January of this year. So right now we're very much in that phase of get the product out to as many people as possible, learn a lot, build out a lot of different aspects of the marketing suite, and then Ultimately, we'll build out different products down the line and other clinicals down the line. But we've kind of done the really hard science stuff, and now we're in the marketing stage. So that's what's immediately on the future. But down the line, there's so many untapped opportunities to help heal the brain from a nutrition perspective, whether it's for a general population in the wellness space, or candidly, whether it is, medical grade and clinical grade products that are nutrient based. So that I think is a really, really exciting space to be in, and just bring that to more consumers. As someone who's worked in the mental health space, for a while, but more, I used to work at Headspace, so went deep kind of in the meditation side of things. Nutrition is incredibly powerful and absolutely foundational for our brains. Like, our brains are made up of what we eat. So when it comes to actually caring for mental health or cognitive health, ultimate brain health, like, what we need is nutrition, and that's really the direction we're going in.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope that everybody can feel how passionate you are about this space. It's really awesome. Okay, and Heather, as the topic today is transparency, we should also talk a little bit about reviews and influencers. And I learned from you, that brands are responsible for taking care of reviews that also include claims. For example, a moisturizer, somebody writes a review that a moisturizer cured eczema. I need to take care of this review. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the first thing I would look at is definitely where the review is coming from. So if it's something that you can control, if it's within your control as the brand owner, then FDA will hold you responsible for those testimonials. And ultimately, when we're looking at testimonials, they are a form of marketing, right? We're trying to get people to buy our product based on what other people have said about our product. So there are cases where FDA, one of the big ones, which we've talked about in a previous webinar, was Zarbee's, where essentially there were testimonials where someone said, oh, your product helped my husband cure his allergies, right? And ultimately, you can say that, oh, I can't control what people say about my product. If it's on your website and you're using those testimonials as marketing, you can absolutely control what's being said. I've done reviews for clients where we'll essentially modify the testimonial. You have to keep it to where it means the same thing, that it has to keep the same meaning, but you can take out certain pieces to make sure that it's not including any of those types of claims. So yes, testimonials, again, because they're a form of marketing, FDA, does regulate those. And even in the case of Zarbee's, the FDA wrote in the warning letter that because Zarbee's liked the comment, that they were actually approving of that claim. And so it actually became their own implied claim. So even something like a like on a social media post, FDA has reached their jurisdiction that far. So it is important on your social media platforms as well to look at that and make sure that your testimonials, and I've had clients who are like, we have 10 years of testimonials. Like, what do we do here? In a perfect world, you would go back and clean those up, and do the best that you can. But ultimately, I can tell you I say this all the time, I can tell you the letter of the law, and then it's your decision what to do with it. So it depends on how risk averse you are, how conservative you are. And then you can make that decision. But ultimately, yes, according to the law, testimonials are claims made by the brand if it's something within your own control.
Okay, and you mentioned social media influencers, right?
Yeah.
I need to pay attention to what influencers are saying about my product, but what about comments to the influencers' post? Is this something that I need to, review as well and clean up?
So again, I think it's based on the amount of control you have. So if you're paying an influencer to market your brand, then it is your responsibility to make sure that they're not saying something outside of the bounds. And like I said earlier, that would be things like if you're in the supplement space, they shouldn't be making disease claims. Or in Suzanne's example, if you're a cosmetic moisturizer, you shouldn't be making eczema claims. Now, if there's an influencer that buys your product on their own and goes on their social media and decides to talk about it, that's kind of outside of your control. And I don't think that's something that FDA would consider your own. FDA has regulated influencers though for saying things. Kim Kardashian received a warning letter for things that she said as an influencer. So it can happen. What our firm does is we actually create guides for influencers of things you should or shouldn't say, so that they can kind of stay on script. And then if going as far as like a comment on that influencer's post, it's not really something you can control per se. So I think it's more, how do you say this? Like if the influencer's post is what stated, this can cure eczema, and then someone made a comment like, oh, I would love for this to cure my eczema, let me try it, and then they try it and it does the same thing and they comment back, ultimately it's leading back to that influencer's post. So that's where the regulation can come in and the regulatory authorities can come in.
Okay, that is very interesting and very good to know for any brand that is utilizing, reviews, testimonials, and also influencer marketing. Now, to wrap things up, before we get into the Q&A, Cristina, if audience members want to get in touch with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find Parable at thinkparable.com. You can find me through that. There's the emails there that you can find me through. And we're fairly active as well on Instagram and have a lot of content that's based on education, both in our Instagram and through our product newsletters. We put a lot of work into that. So if you're interested in brain health, you want to kind of dive into the topic, I'd encourage you to either sign up for the newsletter or give our Instagram a follow. And certainly take a look at the science page. I dropped the link here in the chat a little bit earlier. And if anyone has questions as well, if you're thinking about, do I do a study? How do I do a study? Was it worth it? From a business perspective, feel free to reach out to me and I'll see if I can lend some words of wisdom. Otherwise, I think, Suzanne and her team are incredible in terms of actually designing the studies. And Heather, from what I know of you so far, I would love to have you as my legal counsel. So it takes a village to make these things happen.
Right. Absolutely.
And Heather, how can audience members get in touch with you?
Sure. So on our website, bustoslawgroup.com, we have our Calendly page, which essentially allows you to schedule a free 15-minute consultation where we could sit down, kind of strategize, see how we align. If you want to contact us by email, it's info@bustoslawgroup.com.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we already have a couple of questions. Okay, this one is for Heather. It's about claims. What if doctors or other affiliates or retailers are actually making claims to their patients? That's very interesting.
Okay, let's unwrap all of that, because those are a couple of different things. I mean, if it's doctors making it directly to their patients about your product and you didn't tell the doctor to say anything, I mean, that's going to be under their medical license. And I deal with a lot of clients who are doctors. Obviously, they design products all the time. So yeah, if it's advice from a doctor to use a certain product, that's going to be under their medical license. I wouldn't consider that an FDA issue. If it's retailers on their own website and you have no control. So for example, I mean, okay, the parts where you'll definitely have, the places where you'll definitely have control is something like Amazon, right? You're creating your own posting. So that's where you would be responsible for that. If it's like a third party reviewing your product, I'm trying to think like where it would go out to, because ultimately, for the most part, when you're dealing with retail, you're going to have some control over what's being said. Maybe not control over the comments. So let's say you sell your product at Target, you have control over maybe like how the product is presented on the website, but not over the comments. So the comments would be, I think, far out enough where you wouldn't be responsible for that. But I think it's more like, if there is a way for you, there's a good way to think about it. If there is a way for you to go through and sanitize these testimonials, if you have control over whether they show up or not on a certain platform, then that's where I think your responsibility would come in to make sure they're removed. Because ultimately, what FDA is looking for, here's a little gem. What FDA is looking at is the lay consumer. So they want to know, they want to look at a product and the marketing and all of that in totality. What would a lay consumer think that your product does? And ultimately, if it's something like a supplement or a cosmetic where, you know, the really big line right there, right, is it a drug or a cosmetic? Is it a drug or a supplement? You want to make sure that all of your claims are within that and that you're not making any disease claims, because what FDA is going to say is, well, would that consumer now take your product instead of taking their prescription? Would they think that now instead of my eczema cream that was prescribed by my doctor, I can take this cosmetic and treat my eczema? So that's kind of the thinking that FDA uses. Whether I agree with it or not is another story, but that's the thinking that they use, is from a lay consumer perspective, what would the intended use of that product be? So I think that that's a good way to kind of see it and think about the types of claims and the type of marketing and making sure you're staying within your own category.
And it probably comes down to, so for example, I have been vegetarian for quite a while now, and I have been prescribed B12.
Yeah.
But then, you know, this B12 is, and yeah, my doctor has a favorite brand of B12. So she
Yeah.
told me that this is her favorite brand, but then this is not tied to the brand, right? If this is just a brand that she mentioned to me.
Right. I think that's a different story. But I think ultimately, again, if the doctor is giving this to their patients, it's going to fall under their medical license, in my opinion. And my doctor does the same. They recommend like supplements and things like that, which I think is great personally. But you know, the idea is that would fall under their medical license and their ability as a doctor to, you know, give that information to their patient.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Great. Are there any more questions? Okay, got a bunch more questions in. Again, for Heather, does every structure function claim need to be submitted to the FDA, even if there's sufficient scientific backing to substantiate it?
It's funny that we just had that conversation, Suzanne.
I thought so too.
Yeah, we just had that conversation. So yeah, many people may not be aware, but you are supposed to, again, I'm going to tell you the letter of the law. You are supposed to submit within 30 days of marketing any structure function claims. The reason that they do this is there's this joint jurisdiction between FDA and FTC. So FDA has this portal where they say, we're going to collect all of the claims. You also have to submit your labeling with that and the name of your product. And essentially, you're at the very end, you're certifying that you have substantiation. So that portal is essentially FDA's way of capturing, hey, this brand says they have substantiation. So if the FTC comes out and asks, where's your substantiation? They can look back and say, hey, but you said you had it. And, you know, substantiation, you don't have to submit it. It's something that you have to keep on file. You do need to have that ready to go. So that's kind of how that system works. It's within 30 days of marketing. If you haven't done it already and you've been on the market, don't freak out. Just go and you know, go to the portal. But I would say make sure that whatever claims you're submitting to that portal have been reviewed and that they are true structure function claims. Make sure that they're not drug claims, because the FDA will bounce back. They have a team that reviews those claims when you submit them, and they will bounce back and say, this is a drug claim. And you don't want to be on FDA's radar. Like, there's no reason to do that. So it's better to make sure you've got all your claims good to go. They're all structure function. You submit them with your labeling, and then, you know, you're clear. So that's my advice on that.
And does the FDA actually enforce like this whole registration of structure function claims?
They can. I wouldn't say, like, on a scale of risk, I love to do the scale of risk. is, I would say this is probably like below a 5, right? This is like on the lower end of risk if you don't submit it. What's the riskier part is if you submit it and don't have the substantiation, right? Like that's actually worse. So if you say like, screw it, I'm not going to submit that, but I have all my substantiation and it's down packed, I think you're in it's a better risk profile than I didn't submit and I don't have substantiation. That's a definite no-no. So those are kind of the levels that I would say.
Yeah, I just thinking about, that you submit something without substantiation sounds a little weird.
I
But I'm
mean,
sure it happens.
and it may be under substantiation. Like people may think that they have the right amount and they don't have the right amount. Sometimes I've had to take clients' word for it. I've offered to review and they're like, we're good, we have it. I mean, they may not understand what the requirements are. And that's, it's more just ignorance versus they're doing anything purposeful. They may just not know what the level should be.
Okay, that is very interesting. And I think this is also, in regards to time, a great, point to wrap things up. And, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today. I hope you learned something and had fun listening to Cristina and Heather. And we can reach out to Citrus Labs at citruslabs.com or by sending an email to hello@citruslabs.com. And again, thank you so much for attending. Our next webinar will be with an amazing brand called Vitract, which is transforming health through the gut. And in this webinar, we'll talk about evolving consumer health experience and the changing values and decision-making motivations of consumers and why they are leaving, their standard physician and are looking toward more functional medicine. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and see you all next time.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye.
Thank you, Cristina.
You guys, bye.